What are your thoughts on this convergence of sacred ceremony and the oh so sticky topic, especially within spiritual communities, of money? Someone recently made a radical comment to me that I am walking the predator path because I engage in monetary exchange for sacred ceremony. And wow, this one's a loaded conversation, pretty much akin to walking into a minefield where old traumas, moral taboos, inherited assumptions are buried just beneath the surface, waiting to explode. Now, this initial comment, like many others, was flavored with assumption, projection, personal attack, and even spiritual threat. And since stepping into more visibility, particularly within the social media world, I've well and truly come to expect projections from fear, misunderstandings, unresolved wounds. And then also, some of the remarks just seem to be plain ignorant or dumb judgments that are cast my way, which I typically largely ignore. And that's the thing. There's always going to be haters and complainers, and you're never going to please everyone. But what made me want to open up this dialogue on a deeper level is that one, spirituality and money. This is an important conversation to be having. And two, this comment came from a craftsperson involved in the spiritual and ceremonial community who literally sells sacred items and tools for ceremony. And that's just so interesting that one can stand at this convergence of this capitalist economy and sacred ceremony and yet still project this moral superiority and high ground and spiritual purity onto others regarding this intersection of both ceremony and money. It's a conversation that's thick with shadow, personal wounds, cultural and collective trauma, unspoken taboos. And as difficult as it can be for some people to respectfully engage in this kind of conversation because of the harm and the trauma that's present, this is a powerful mirror, this conversation. It's a conversation that we need to remain open to within these modern times, particularly within the spiritual and the sacred ceremonial communities. So, in this episode of Birdsong, I want to open that up. And also, if you're new here, I'm your host, Caiyuda. This one is being presented not as an argument, not in defense, but to begin to explore and tease apart more of the nuance, the context, and provide more perspective when it comes to these deeper tensions, this psychic charge that we're sitting with within this convergence of money, ceremony, the sacred, financial exchange, reciprocity, integrity, ethics, accountability, power dynamics, and all of these related themes. There's a lot of complexity in this conversation, and I want to say from the get-go that I wouldn't dare claim to have all of the answers here or all of the appropriate questions. And I'm well aware that I don't necessarily have a complex systems thinking mind like some of the intellectuals of our time, like Daniel Schmachtenberger, Eric Weinstein, Charles Eisenstein. However, like many of you, I do share in this deep reverence for the sacred ways. And after being in the shamanic ceremonial space for well over a decade as both a participant, but also a facilitator of shamanic initiation processes, wilderness rites, earth honoring ceremonies, plant medicine, and psychedelic journeys, I've come to know, like many of us, the importance in upholding integrity, accountability, ethical practice, reciprocity. And also, in saying all of that, I want to still question the assumptions, the ones that get passed around within spiritual circles like unexamined truths, the ideas that money inherently corrupts the sacred, that to charge for ceremonial work is by default unethical, and that charging money inevitably leads to predatory behavior, spiritual downfall, and exploiting the vulnerable. Also, that if you're visible, you must be selling out. There's a lot here, so buckle in and let us start with the psychic charge that money inherently corrupts sacredness. We can certainly wax lyrical about one, money being inherently neutral, but then also two, the fiat monetary system being corrupt and problematic. But look, to hone our focus for a moment, from this neutral perspective, yes, it's a tool for tracking value and facilitating exchange. There's definitely truth here. Money itself certainly doesn't seem to have an agenda or no moral weight, no inherent meaning. It is what we make it to be. But that's the thing. Money is rarely ever experienced as neutral. It's rarely just numbers on a screen or notes in a wallet. It is wrapped up in so many stories of worth, status, survival, power, identity. You can think of it like water taking the shape of whatever container holds it, except the container here, it's our entire cultural psyche. So it's taking the form of our deepest stories about who deserves what, whether we're enough, what security means, how value gets determined. It really has become this dense symbol carrying generations and generations of story, identity, conditioning. And because of this charge, it's no wonder that there is this intense electric pulse when money enters the temple of the sacred. For a lot of people, the money wound is still wide open from religious dogma, ancestral trauma, family patterns around scarcity and shame, systemic exploitation, colonialist extraction, economic hardship. Rarely is there this clean, neutral territory when it comes to money. And there are certainly a lot of raw nerve endings when it comes to anything that smells like profit, particularly within sacred ceremonial or spiritual healing contexts. And, from one perspective, that's fair. If we are to dial in our focus and double click on the sacred medicine world, there's a lot of harsh truths that need to be confronted. People are over harvesting. Traditional communities are now finding themselves caught in the web of extraction, of these import export systems, of the increasing pressure of modern supply and demand dynamics, which is taking a toll on ecosystems and leaving various species endangered, threatened with extinction. What was once relational has now become transactional. There's a lot that we could unpack here. There's a lot of this that still goes unacknowledged. There's a lot of pain, of anger. There is a lot of grief. There can be a visceral response to this merging of worlds. And it's here that money can be a nervous system trigger. Anger, fear, freeze, collapse. And so when we're talking about this stuff, it's not just a conversation that is relegated to mindset, as in brain based cognition, brain based thinking. Instead, it can be a very real somatic response. There are imprints that live in the body regarding this conversation. And so, when money meets the sacred, when we talk about exchange within ceremonial or spiritual spaces, rarely is it ever just about money. And that's why it can feel so charged. It can feel so super messy. There's a lot of moral assumptions entangled in this one, that money inherently corrupts sacredness, which you could say it creates this false binary that it is either the sacred or the monetized, with nothing in between. It doesn't leave room for nuance, for complexity. And some people do believe that the sacred should be kept apart, elevated above the marketplace, and that if something is truly sacred or truly spiritual, it should be offered freely, without price, without expectation. And while this idea might seem noble on the surface, it does often hide behind this kind of moral superiority, this spiritual purity idealism that's disconnected from the reality of being human, of having bodies to care for, of having bills, responsibilities, families to look after, societies that we're tethered to in a variety of ways. And this is the thing: spirituality does not mean severing from the physical. It's this false binary split, because the physical is spiritual. This entire experience that we're having is spiritual. Not just the moments of transcendence on the meditation mat or in the prayer circle or in the sacred ceremony or this desire for ascension. Spirituality isn't about bypassing the human experience. It's about being fully present in it, which includes embracing the material world as a canvas for growth and navigating all of the complexities of physical reality. So, if we do want to throw a bit of a spiritual lens on it, if you want to call it that or say it in this way, money itself is acting as a sacred mirror, reflecting our own discomforts around power, self worth, our capacity to ask and receive. You could look at money as fire. There's lots of ways that you could look at money. But when we do look at it as fire, it can burn down and aid in destruction just as much as it can warm and nurture. And when it comes to money and materialism, there's a lot of people who use spirituality as an excuse to stay stuck, spiritualizing poverty, denouncing materialism because of a belief that it's unspiritual, demonizing our desires for material acquisition. And yeah, a lot of spiritual people reject the idea of money and wealth because of this perceived external corruption. But often, it's masking these unexamined wounds: fear of visibility, fear of worthiness, old ascetic programming. And it's here that renouncing money can actually become a socially rewarded form of spiritual bypass. And in all of these tensions, the wounding around money and spirituality grows and it grows and it grows. It doesn't make it any easier that we're navigating late stage capitalism. We're paying rent, we've got bills, we're trying to live in integrity and incorporate these kinds of conversations and values into a system that typically doesn't reward spiritual nuance or sacred service. And to return to the initial comment that I received, there was this moral assumption, an accusation that charging money for ceremony, as I mentioned earlier, inevitably leads to predatory behavior, spiritual downfall, and exploiting the vulnerable. And sure, that can and does happen. But to claim that receiving money for ceremonial work is by default unethical is not a blanket truth that can be just cast over everything and everyone. The reality is typically much more complex and nuanced, and the truth is that exchange of value has long been part of human relationships. Now, this commenter even went so far to say things in a way that felt like weaponizing spirituality in this righteous kind of way, saying that everyone has the right to pray, and when the spirits come after you and your people, I hope that they're merciful. Now, that doesn't feel like appropriate accountability, rather, spiritual threats and ideological and emotional projection to try and invoke fear and consequence from wrongdoing. Now, yes, I do agree that every human has the right to pray freely. And also, there are differences between commodifying the sacred, predation of the vulnerable, and finding right livelihood through sacred service in our day and age. This idea that modern ceremonial evolution equals impurity, or that ceremonial facilitation is only reserved for a select few, or that adaptation and evolution equals dilution, doesn't respect the fullness of what's unfolding today. As I said, exchange in some form has always been part of the equation. So, to deepen this, it's a good thing to bring awareness to some of how humans have navigated this terrain of appropriate exchange over time, from animal skins and sacred beads to things like PayPal and Patreon. We're talking about the dynamics of traditional reciprocity all the way through to modern times. In truth, reciprocity has always been central to ceremonial exchange, whether through food, various items, blankets, livestock, labor, tobacco, all kinds of gifts or offerings or resources. And in traditional land based communities, yeah, these all made sense. However, within modern contexts, in modern society, money has become one of the primary means of exchange. Not necessarily because it's better, but because it's what has come to work as society has expanded and adapted in a way in which most people are no longer living on shared ancestral land and growing their own food, creating their own clothing, making all of our own medicines, trading livestock. And with this shift, the energetics of exchange have also shifted. The dominant exchange story or the money story that we've come to create and inherit is primarily transactional. I give you this, you give me that. And perhaps you could say that in one sense, It is clear. It's linear. It's closed. There's no strings. But this is the thing. It's not the only story that's available to us, nor is it the only story that has been written in the past. And Charles Eisenstein, he speaks about this in his book, Sacred Economics, where he says, money is a story that we agree upon. There is no fixed, static truth about how money can be used. It's not inherently corrupt. It's tied to a story. And we can choose what kind of story that we're creating. Now, in many traditional contexts, people quite obviously didn't pull out their debit card and transfer funds via Stripe. Exchanged, as I mentioned, involved food, labor, personally crafted items, offerings, gifts. So there was still this perceived value inherent within these exchanges, but it formed part of this living loop of reciprocity. The anthropologist Marcel Mauss wrote about this in The Gift, that in traditional societies, gift giving wasn't just about the object, it was about the relationship, sacred reciprocity, the obligation to give in return for receiving. And in saying that, it wasn't necessarily an immediate exchange that happened, and certainly not with the invoices and the systems that we've become accustomed to today, but in a way that continued to sustain the fabric of connection within community, sustaining this fabric of trust, belonging, relational continuity. And then what are the differences between exchange being transactional versus relational? You could say that the former moves in a straight line. It's linear. Start, stop, finish, done. Relationship complete. While the latter, you could say, moves in circles. Ongoing connection. As mentioned, relational continuity. Now, you might suspect, just as I do, that there's much more nuance that could be teased apart here. And if you do have any thoughts on this, I'd love to hear it. Ceremonially speaking, the traditional story is that healers, shamans, medicine people were inherently supported by their community. And not because it was demanded, but because of this inherent understanding that these people were caring for the soul of the tribe. And in turn, the tribe would then care for them, sustaining the fabric of connection, belonging, ongoing relationality within that entire contextual field. Traditional support was part of this web of relating, part of the ecosystem. Everything nourished something else. And in this day and age, with the wide dispersal of community and people in place, medicine people, sacred ceremonialists aren't necessarily supported in these traditional ways. And it makes sense because community is no longer stitched together in these same traditional ways from times of old. So these medicine people, or these people who are filling these roles, they might find themselves walking this path without the traditional structures of support. And that means they still have to pay money for medicine, for training, acquiring the necessary resources to better support their people. They still have to eat and pay rent and bills and mortgages and send their children to school, or acquiring homeschooling resources, extracurricular activities, all of this stuff. Perhaps I'm stating the obvious here. So, in modern times, in current context, using money doesn't necessarily automatically erase the sacredness of an exchange. It's our relationship with this exchange and the people on the other side of it that helps to determine this. And yeah, I get it. Like I've said, there's a lot to unpack here, there's a lot of nuance. So, maybe it's a good time to take a breath and let me ask you this. What story about money are you living inside of? And is it supporting you and your people in a good way? Whereabouts are you invited to rewrite that story with more grace, more intention, more connection? The dominant story might say, if it involves money, it's tainted. But an alternate story, a more healthy story, might say, if it involves the heart, it can be holy. In saying that, in complex times, you could say that we need more context to make greater sense of what's happening. And to do that, We can't really ignore the reality that many Western facilitators benefit economically from traditions whose original people remain marginalized. Cultures have been stripped bare, land has been stolen. A lot of people have been severely disempowered, deprived, oppressed, killed. A lot of us in modern ceremonial facilitator contexts are riding on the backs of that. And depending on your reference point, there can be blurred lines between cultural adaptation, cultural pollination, misappropriation. There's a lot of charge, a lot of trauma here. And these are big considerations of how to navigate all of this with sensitivity and integrity. And everyone's going to have different ideas. Some might say that there's caution required to ensure that we are not trying to operate or rush into support from this place of the savior complex. That's happened throughout history, perhaps as part of the reason of how we've gotten here today. So instead of rushing in with this savior complex, ensure that we're listening, allowing space for self empowerment and autonomy, and finding right ways to give back. Reciprocity, sacred reciprocity. And truth be told, a lot of us here are small fries in big ponds, heeding a greater call to provide pathways for our own smaller communities for healing, awakening, empowerment, growth, transformation. I find it an interesting position to be in because, on one side, there are truly traditional indigenous cultures that anchor in wisdom ways and medicine ways and a call to right relationship, healthy relationship with Earth as a whole. And on the other, there are these multinational corporations sucking as much juice out of the world as they can with government systems and supposed authority figures that like to retain as much power and control over the worldwide populace. And then here we are as bridge people, somewhere in between, having arrows slung our way. And we're holding space for a lot of these judgments and projections and unresolved woundings from people like those who initially commented and instigated this entire conversation that I'm opening up. So, in one sense, you got to give thanks to people that make these kind of comments who allow a deepening and an expansion of these types of conversations. There are definitely layers of privilege to be aware of when it comes to all manner of things: available resources, passports, social media access, biogeographic and demographic relationality, where we find ourselves, language fluency, all of these things. And, perhaps it's a good thing to ask ourselves, what's the impact and the implications of reaching across borders into traditional cultures and sacred ecologies? What's the impact? What's the implications? It's complex. I mean, there's no denying that we are living in very syncretic times, and cross cultural exchange and pollination and adaptation and evolution has always been part of this arc, always been part of this equation. So, one might say that to try and grasp onto this static idealism of traditional purity, or wanting to keep things exactly as they are, or to revert back to perhaps what might be these romanticized times, that might seem fruitless. Culture and tradition has always moved and shifted on the back of time and change, for better or worse. And yet, even still, there's an invitation to look and to listen about how we can walk respectfully amongst each other. So, there's definitely a lot to consider within this wider lens of relational context here. I'm not an expert. I don't have all the questions nor the answers. But when it comes to privilege and accessibility and predatory behavior, yes, we can say that there are facilitators who exploit, just as there are ceremonial consumers. And then also, there are devoted practitioners who give their lives to these ways with sincerity, humility, care. And perhaps instead of condemning financial exchange through the lens of moral superiority or spiritual purity, there might be better questions to be asking. Is this exchange rooted in integrity, respect, and reciprocity? How are we relating with these origins and lineages? How are we navigating cross cultural pollination, misappropriation, adaptation, appreciation, accountability? How do we relate with traditions and communities that have experienced and still do experience the heavy hand of colonialism and exploitation and extraction? They're not necessarily easy questions to answer, and it's not a static dialogue. It's an emerging conversation. And we are smack bang in the middle of a time where the old ways and new realities are meeting and merging, sometimes clumsily, but in so many ways, an absolute necessity. Culture and ceremony, they're both evolving, and so is our understanding of value, exchange, and what it means to serve. Now, we've explored some of the context of the history of exchange, reciprocity, stories around money and the sacred, the distortions around what could be seen as pure or spiritual, a lot of the important considerations and implications of how it is that we're relating with ceremony and tradition. And then at some point, you could make the point we've got to ask, well, if we are dealing with money, what does it look like practically to create terms of engagement and exchange that feels integrous to our values and aligned with the depth of what's being offered? Because if we are to hone our focus in this direction for a moment, there's a difference between pricing that is designed to extract and pricing that's designed to invite. Pricing can be a portal, a threshold moment. When someone gives generously, they often approach these experiences with more presence, more intention, more readiness. And you might have experienced this yourself, that the ones who invest a considerable amount of money show up more fully than the ones who get a freebie. I mean, yeah, it's not always the case, but this is a common thread. Money carries energy, it reflects values, intention, readiness. And when we do approach it and use it consciously, it can become a tool that can facilitate clarity rather than contamination. Everyone has to find out what works for them and what kind of scaffolding they want to create and be involved in and how they want to operate. And there's discernment that's required due to all of the ego trips and the power dynamics. There's all the shadows that reside in this space. It makes me think that just as overcharging can become out of alignment, so can undercharging. A lot of people want to be generous, accessible, kind. And then also there can be an undervaluing of one's own work and worth, an overextension, a hyperextension of oneself that actually depletes rather than regenerates. Consistently giving without receiving in appropriate measure can lead to resentment. It can erode capacity to actually keep showing up for our people and actually being supportive to our people in a good way. The same could be said about discount culture. When people expect discounts automatically, especially within spiritual spaces, because of many of the threads that we've talked about here, it's often not just about gaining or having access, but it's flavored in this transactional mindset that begins to leak into the relational field. And from a facilitator's point of view, when facilitators do say yes out of fear or guilt, pandering, people pleasing, there's greater potential there for you to be moving more out of alignment with your own integrity and your own values. And you could say that it is a fawn response masquerading as generosity. So, kindness isn't necessarily saying yes to everything. Generosity isn't necessarily giving more than what you have. So, if a price extends beyond your capacity to pay, it's not necessarily like that as a wall that keeps people out, but also in the same breath, it could very well be an intentionally created threshold investment that clarifies the kind of presence and intention and commitment and potential for life changing transformation that's being held, with the invitation for you to meet on a similar level with that same kind of intention and integrity. So it's not always just about the number, it's about the energetic commitment that one is being called into, a boundary that clarifies what kind of engagement is being invited in. Not necessarily in an elitist, exclusionary way, but in a way that says, this is a serious space. This is deep work. It's a transformational threshold, and your commitment matters. So, in this sense, pricing could be seen as a form of respect for the facilitator and all that's required, for the work, and also for the participant too, because it invites everyone to meet with equal integrity. And it's here that price can be based on what it takes to sustain the work, what honors the depth of the offering, what allows us to show up fully with no resentment or burnout or scarcity patterns. There's certainly no one size fits all formula here. And as I keep saying, yeah, there's nuance to all of these conversations. And there are models that you could implement or that we could look to that can foster the spirit of reciprocity, whether that's through sliding scales, pay it forward dynamics, partial scholarships, pay what you can, but with clear framing and energetic hygiene. It could be through gift or labor exchange, optional contribution tiers for deeper one on one or private support. There's so many different ways, and everyone has to feel into their own personal rightness here. You're allowed to be creative. You're allowed to charge well for deep work and also offer free resources on the side. You're allowed to honor the sacred, but also make a living. It's not necessarily about getting it perfect. It's about continually orienting ourselves towards right relationship with ourselves, with the work, with the communities that we're and our people that we're here to serve, and also with the people and the places from where our ceremonial work may come. Now, to begin to tie a bow on this, after exploring some of these themes that can carry so much charge, there's another element here that can be super edgy for a lot of people: visibility. Are you willing to be seen? Because here's the thing: so many of us are carrying medicine, insight, beauty, healing, and yet still people stay hidden. And often it's because somewhere along the way, being seen got coded as being dangerous. Collective memories in the deep psyche of the burnings of the witches, the mystics that were mocked, the ones who were outcast from thinking or behaving differently. The feeling that if you are really visible, you'll get judged, cancelled, ridiculed. Someone will expose your flaws. And so people will often polish themselves into some kind of public performance or just shrink away or hide or say things like, well, I'll just let people find me naturally. And there's a cost to that. The cost to that is the people that you are here to serve can't find you if you're hiding. And so visibility in this sense isn't saying, look at me, look at me. Rather, it's saying, here I am. And there's a difference to that. It's speaking from your truth, even if and when your voice shakes a little. It's letting people witness you and your work, your values, your soul, without controlling how they react or respond, without needing to be liked by everyone. And for sure, there's a vulnerability to that. The more you show up, the more likely it is that someone will project something onto you. You're a fraud. You've sold out. You're wrong. You're an idiot. People judge, sometimes loudly, sometimes silently. And, a lot of the time, it's actually not about us or not about you. It's people's own misconceptions. I mean, that's what has sparked this episode. And like I've said, personally, on a personal level, I've come to expect it. And being able to face it in a healthy way from my experience, it's not just a mental thing. It's a big part of it, but it also requires nervous system work. Being okay with being seen is a deeply somatic experience. And so visibility can feel risky. But what if it's more than that? What if it's not just a risk, but a responsibility? Not to be perfect, not to have all the answers, but to show up for your people and to keep showing up for yourself. To say something like, I don't have it all figured out, but I'm here. I'm doing the work. I'm tending to the fire. So, real visibility in this context isn't about performance or professionalism. It's about presence in alignment to who you really are and what it is that you truly stand for. We can't always escape the systems that we're in, but we can begin to encode them with different values. We can reduce the tension between being a spiritual guide and running a business by reframing business as a vehicle for sacred service, a vehicle for impact in a good way, not extraction. And it's here that sacred economics might mean evolving our relational intelligence and not abolishing or hiding from money, but reclaiming the meaning within it and how we relate to all of these converging themes. The sacred isn't necessarily defined by what something is, but how we relate to it. And Mircea Eliade says in his book, The Sacred and the Profane, a rock, for example, a rock becomes sacred not because it's rare or not because it's necessarily different from all the other rocks, but instead because it reveals itself as sacred. A hierophany, Mircea Eliade calls it, a hierophany. It reveals the sacred within itself. And we come to see the sacred in it. Just like a space becomes holy when we see it and treat it as such. And so we got to ask ourselves, is money inherently profane, or is it the meaning that we project onto it? Is business inherently corrupt, or can it become a temple when built with integrity? And offering ourselves all of these reframes, money then doesn't have to become an enemy. It becomes a way to redistribute energy, a way to tend to ourselves while tending to others, a way to make sure that we can keep showing up for the long arc of this work without burning out or selling out or numbing out. It's up to us to find and infuse the sacred into more aspects of our lives. And when it comes to this emerging conversation of ceremony, money, reciprocity, tradition, culture, psychedelics, plant medicine, predatory motives, the marginalized, exploitation, adaptation, misappropriation, cross-cultural pollination, and evolution, many of us are listening and learning and walking with sincerity and humility as best as we can. And this is how living traditions adapt and serve the moment that they're in within the reality of current context. So here's what I want to leave you with. What would it mean to live your life as an offering? What if your visibility was a prayer? What if your contributions, your economy, your livelihood was a sacred garden, seeded with intention, tended with integrity? What would it mean to find ways to give back in ways that feel right, that support, that cultivate relationality with community, with tradition, with land, with grassroots movements that seek to empower in a good way? How can we navigate this convergence with more care and more curiosity? One might suggest that we don't need to abandon the material to walk a sacred path. We need to sanctify it. And that's the kind of wealth that will always be available to us. All right, people. Well, that's another episode of Birdsong. I'll leave you with those reflections. And before I let you go, I will mention two things. The first thing, our applications for our Spring 2025 Vision Quest here in Victoria, Australia are open. Early birds for this are available until August 4th. And the dates for this Vision Quest are October 4th till October 11th. Springtime dreaming, just after equinox. It's right on the full moon. A potent time to be questing up in the mountainside, right amongst the granite boulders and fresh mountain stream. So you can send me a message or an email if you want more info. And two, if you are walking the path of visionary medicines or psychedelics for healing, growth, awakening, empowerment, or transformation, I have a comprehensive guide on exploring, integrating, and preparing for these shamanic medicine journeys. And it is a multifaceted, multi layered, multidisciplinary program with over 100 videos. If you want to come and check it out, the program is called Visionary Medicines, and you can find the link in the show notes to this episode. Come and connect with me on social media at Caiyuda Kiora. I'll leave you with it. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time.